Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Well, the next 10 days is a critical time for the world. What happens for some means the difference between life and death. That's because on July 17th, that marks the end of an agreement that's pivotal to the global food supply. And we're going to talk about that agreement and what would happen if it's allowed to expire. We will see famine in some countries. So we're going to talk about what that agreement is, what's likely to happen in the next 2 weeks, and how it relates to Bible prophecy, because I believe we can specifically link this to Bible prophecy. So stay tuned till the end. We're going to discuss why that is and how this fits in. But what am I talking about that is July 17th? I'm talking about this right here. This is from Barron's. It's and what they're referring to is the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This was a deal brokered in 2022 between Ukraine and Russia by Turkey in order to allow Ukrainian grains to be exported out of the Black Sea. Because prior to this agreement, the Russian Navy was stopping that from happening. And so Ukrainian exports are critical to the global food supply. So here this article says, UN worried as clock ticks on Ukrainian grain deal, export deal. The United Nations said Wednesday that it was worried about the survival of a grain exports deal for Ukraine, which could collapse within a fortnight, threatening food security for the world's most vulnerable. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, aimed at easing a global food crisis, is set to expire on July 17th unless Russia, which is pressing an invasion of Ukraine launched in February 2022, agrees to its renewal. But Moscow remains unhappy about the operation of the deal's parallel agreement on Russian food and fertilizer exports, and said Tuesday that it saw no reason to extend the deal. Now, all that said, I have to pre-record this and then upload it, right? In that time period, maybe they'll come up with a deal. Maybe an hour after I upload this, they'll come up with a deal. But this is still significant. We're going to talk about why at the end. So even if this is old news, we need to be paying attention to this. So it says, no doubt we're worried because the two agreements signed in Istanbul are very important for food security and for the developing countries in the global south, Rebecca Greenspan, head of the UN's Trade and Development Agency, UNCTAD, told reporters in Geneva. UNCTAD has been a major player in brokering the deals. Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw Ukraine's Black Sea ports blocked by warships until the agreement, signed in July 2022, allowed for the passage of critical grain exports. The initial 120-day agreement struck with the UN and Turkey last July has been extended 3 times, in November, March, and May. The parallel agreement between Moscow and the United Nations is aimed at facilitating the export of Russian food and fertilizers, which are exempt from Western sanctions imposed on Moscow over the Ukraine war. So again, critical to the food supply, Russia is one of the primary exporters of agricultural products and fertilizers that allow nations to grow agricultural products in their own countries. And we know that due to the deindustrialization that's occurring in Europe right now, because of the high energy prices, well, they've shut down a lot of the fertilizer capacity that they had in Europe. So it is vital that these fertilizers from Russia get into the open market if we're to maintain our food supply. So it says, but Russia claims this parallel agreement is not being upheld. We need both to continue bringing prices down and have stable markets of food and fertilizers in the world, Greenspan said. The United Nations remains committed to making every effort for the continuation of the agreements. They remain our main concern, and we hope that we can ensure their extension for the benefit of the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable people in the world. And we've talked about this before. We live in a global marketplace. If there's a shortfall of food, the free market's going to distribute that to the people who can pay for it, which means if it's too expensive for the countries that have the poorest people, the poorest countries per capita, well, they're not going to be able to afford to get what they need. And the countries that have the most wealth per capita, that import a lot of food, like, say, Japan, South Korea, China, the European nations, they will put a bid on that food much higher than other countries can pay. And they'll get their food at a higher price. They'll experience food inflation, but not food shortages, as they say here, the most vulnerable countries and people in the world will. She goes on, she says, we'll continue during the days and hours still left with our efforts to make that happen. Ukraine was one of the world's top grain producers, and the deal has helped soothe the global food crunch triggered by the conflict. And we're going to look at a chart later on showing what's happened since then. But it says some 32.8 million tons have been exported so far under the agreement, according to the UN. Just over half of the exports have been corn, while more than a quarter have been wheat. Greenspan said consultations with a Russian delegation had taken place in Geneva. We will consider, yes, going to Moscow in the days that are left, but that has not been confirmed yet, she added. Russia said Tuesday that the Moscow UN deal had continued to degrade, blaming the problem on secondary effects of Western penalties, meaning Western sanctions, on shipping and insurance companies as well as banks. So here we have this deal could crumble. I think it's unlikely. I think most likely Russia is going to use this as leverage to get things they want. So what is it that Russia wants? Well, we had this article from Reuters from a few weeks ago, June 16th. It says, what is Russia's problem with the Black Sea grain deal? So this will give us a little bit more insight into what is Russia asking for and what are they likely to get. So here it says, the United Nations and Turkey brokered the Black Sea Grain Initiative last July to help tackle a global food crisis worsened by Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and blockade of its Black Sea ports. It allows food and fertilizer to be exported from 3 Ukrainian ports. The deal has been extended 3 times, most recently until July 17th. Nearly 32 million tons of mostly corn and wheat have so far been exported by Ukraine under the deal. The initiative also allows for the safe export of ammonia, a key ingredient in nitrate fertilizer, but none has been shipped. So what does that mean for global agricultural production? To convince Russia to agree to the initiative, a 3-year pact was also struck last July in which the United Nations agreed to help Moscow overcome any obstacles to its own food and fertilizer shipments. While Russian exports of food and fertilizer are not subject to Western sanctions imposed after the invasion, Moscow says restrictions on payments, logistics, and insurance have amounted to a barrier to shipments. So, for instance, because of all of these sanctions issued on Western companies saying you can't do business with Russia, while a lot of the insurance on these vessels is carried in London and New York, places where these companies, they're unsure. I don't know what this means for us. Are we going to be penalized by our own governments if we offer insurance to these ships? So they don't. And if there's no insurance, people aren't willing to take the risk. And so you would have to have much higher prices for those agricultural products for people to be willing to take the risk to do that, so it doesn't get shipped. It says UN spokesperson Stephanie Dujarric said last week that the past months have shown tangible progress on improving Russian exports, but added challenges remain, but we will spare no effort to overcome all remaining obstacles. Why were the deals needed? The poorest in the world were hit worse by the rising global food prices. The UN World Food Program warned in March last year that its ability to feed some 125 million people was under threat because 50% of its grain came from Ukraine. Between 2018 and 2020, Africa imported $3.7 billion in wheat, 32% of total African wheat imports from Russia, and another $1.4 billion from Ukraine, 12% of total African wheat imports, according to the United Nations. The United Nations said last year that 36 countries count on Russia and Ukraine for more than half of their wheat imports, including some of the poorest and most vulnerable, including Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Under the Black Sea grain deal, more than 625,000 tons of grain has so far been shipped for aid operations in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Yemen. In 2022, WFP procured more than half its global wheat grain from Ukraine. So what are the Russian complaints? Well, Putin complained that Russia has been cheated by the West because its own exports still faced problems. The United States has dismissed Russia's grievances. U.S. Ambassador to the UN said last month it is exporting grain and fertilizer at the same levels, if not higher, than before the full-scale invasion. And that may be true, but a much higher price is my guess on that. Putin said Russia only agreed to the deal for the sake of countries in Africa and Latin America, but that only around 3.2 to 3.4% of the grain goes to the world's poorest countries, while 40% went to prosperous countries. And we talked about this in a previous video. Again, this is due to the food inflation. So we saw prices soar following the invasion. And these countries, the wealthier countries, can afford to pay more, so they bid up the price. And based on a free market, that food, those agricultural products, are going to go where they can get the highest price. And so we have a lot of the Ukrainian grain has been going to Western Europe. And you have a lot of European countries complaining, wanting tariffs to be put on that because it's undercutting the prices that they would normally charge, and it's flooding Europe with what is to Europe cheap grain, but is expensive to these other countries. According to UN data, around 3% of exports under the Black Sea deal have gone to low-income countries, while high-income countries get around 44%, and the rest go to middle-income states. The United Nations has always said the deal was a commercial enterprise and not intended to be entirely humanitarian, but that it benefited poorer countries by helping lower food prices globally. Russia's demands, what are they? Well, in a letter to the UN officials in March, Russia spelled out the demands it once met in exchange for its continued cooperation in the grain deal. Moscow wants the Russian Agricultural Bank reconnected to the SWIFT payment system. The bank was cut off from SWIFT by the EU in June last year over the invasion. An EU spokesperson has said the bloc is not considering the reinstatement of Russian banks. As a workaround, UN officials got JP Morgan Chase to start processing some Russian grain export payments with reassurances from the US government. The United Nations is also working with the African Export-Import Bank to create a platform to help process transactions for Russian exports of grain and fertilizer to Africa. Russia wants the resumption of its Black Sea ammonia exports via a pipeline from Russia's Togliatti to Ukraine's Pivdenia port. Don't know if I said that right. The pipeline, which pumped up to 2.5 million tons of ammonia annually, was shut down by the war. In September, Reuters reported that the UN proposed that Russian fertilizer producer Uralchem sell its ammonia to U.S.-headquartered commodities trader Tramo once it reaches the Russian-Ukraine border via the pipeline. Until the ammonia pipeline is restarted, Moscow has said it will limit the number of vessels allowed to travel to the port under the Black Sea grain deal. UN data shows no ships have visited the port for more than a month. Last week, Russia accused Ukrainian forces of blowing up part of the pipeline, the world's longest carrying ammonia in Ukraine's Kharkiv region. The regional Ukrainian governor said Russia had shelled the pipeline. Neither side provided evidence. More than 400,000 tons of Russian fertilizer was also initially stranded in European Union ports after the war was started, though UN officials have negotiated its release. Russia also wants a resumption of supplies to Russia of agricultural machinery and spare parts, lifting restrictions on insurance and access to ports for Russian ships and cargo, and unblocking accounts and financial activities of Russian fertilizer companies. So what is Russia saying? Well, they're basically saying they want some of these sanctions that were imposed following the invasion of Ukraine, they want those sanctions lifted in exchange for a continuation of the grain deal. And so far, neither side is willing to blink on this. So what's going to happen? What is Russia saying? Well, they are saying, this is from Reuters, an article titled "Kremlin Yet to Decide on Black Sea Grain Deal," as UN calls for extension. They're saying there's still time to fulfill that part of the agreements that concerns our country. Until now, this part has not been completed, and accordingly, at the moment, unfortunately, there are no particular grounds for extending this deal. So Russia is saying, what's in it for us? If we don't get what we want, we will not extend this deal. Now, what's likely to happen? And again, maybe as you're watching this, the deal has been extended. I don't know. I can't know that. But again, as we get into this, we're going to find out this is critical to I think this plays a critical role in Bible prophecy. So what is going to happen here? What is most likely to happen? Well, I think most likely Russia is going to extend this deal, but they're going to use it as leverage to break down some of these sanctions barriers. Now, I could be wrong. Before this channel came into existence, and we were talking about this when the war in Ukraine broke out, they had Russian troops at the border of Ukraine, and I thought certainly this isn't going to happen. That's what I thought. I thought the United States, NATO, they're going to come out and they're going to say, back away, and we will sign an agreement that Ukraine will not join NATO. Problem solved. I thought that's what this was all about. Russia was trying to make that happen, and that there would be no invasion, and I was wrong. So I think now, though, they will most likely extend this deal, but I was wrong then, could be wrong now. And so if there is a real possibility that this deal is a no-go and that the Black Sea ports start getting blocked again, well, then we have a global food crisis. And again, this doesn't mean that if you're in the United States or the UK, that the grocery stores are empty of food, but it means those poorer countries we just talked about will face food shortages and famine. We'll see more food inflation on top of what we've already seen over the past 1 to 3 years. You're going to see it get even worse, and to see this bid globally that drives up food prices, agricultural commodities all over the globe. And to take a look at where that stands right now, while we have this information, this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. It's their global price of food index. And it goes back about 30 years to give us an indication of where food prices stand. And if you notice, we hit a peak in April of last year. This is 6 weeks following the invasion of Ukraine, where people were wondering, is that grain going to make it out of Ukraine? And that drove prices up. But then as the terms of this deal became clear and those exports started to resume, we saw prices drop, but they've only dropped about 15% from that high they were at now. And right now this index is at 142. That is higher than any time pre-invasion, pre-Ukraine-Russia conflict. Higher than back in, was this April 2011, it was 132.8. If you remember, that was the time of the Arab Spring. It started in Tunisia, all the social unrest. The government of Egypt fell as a result of that. Many believe all of that started because of high food prices. There's an old adage, beware not of the angry man, beware of the hungry man. And so if people can't feed themselves, then you get widespread social unrest and you get governments falling in many countries. So, guys, if for whatever reason Ukrainian grain does not make it out to the world, we're going to see these prices skyrocket upward. And it's going to have a huge impact globally because agricultural commodities, they trade globally, just like the price of oil. They go to whoever will bid the most. And if there's a shortfall in what's available, well, you can't say, well, I'll buy that food next year. I don't need it this year. You need food. So people will bid that up first before anything else. And that's going to make it unaffordable for these smaller countries and create famine conditions in those poorer countries. So what does this have to do with Bible prophecy? Well, we know Jesus pointed to famines as a general sign of the time before he comes, but I think what's more important to notice here is, regardless of whether this deal is extended or not, it shows how tenuous the global food supply chain is, that an agreement involving one nation just saying, no, I'm not going to extend that agreement. One nation doing that can cause a global food crisis. That tells us just how fragile that supply chain is. When we read in the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 6, we read about the opening moments of the tribulation period. We see global war. We see slaughter everywhere, it says. And that is followed by a global food inflation, a massive food inflation where an entire day's wages is barely enough to buy enough food for one person to barely survive. So we're looking at massive food inflation on a scale never seen before, on a global scale. Could that have happened in past generations? I don't think so, because what happened in South America and 1,000 years ago didn't impact what was going on in the Middle East 1,000 years ago, but today it does. Something that happens in one area of the world has a direct impact on what happens in the entire world. And we've seen what happens when we have an event like this. It can impact global food prices. And so we're in a scenario right now where we could easily see this conflict between Russia and Ukraine erupt into global war. And we could see how that would easily lead to massive food inflation and famine on a global scale, just as the book of Revelation says. Now, am I saying that I think the tribulation is going to start in 2 weeks? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is this is more stage setting that we're seeing for the first time. We're seeing that all of these things converge together. We're seeing the stage set for the tribulation events to play out. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, guys, Jesus could come back at any moment. So we should be preparing. We should be focused on him. We should be spreading the love and hope of Jesus Christ to as many people as we can. But you need to make sure you're right with God. If you don't know Jesus Christ, you need to invite him into your life today. You're a sinner. I'm a sinner. That just means that we've fallen short of God's perfect standard. But the good news is that Jesus Christ, he did live a perfect life. And yet he obediently went to the cross and died on the cross, spilled his blood for our sins so that we could be reconciled with God and have eternal life. Guys, that's the good news. All you have to do is say, Jesus, I believe that. I accept that. Please, save me. And he will do that. Put your trust in Christ and you will not be disappointed. So guys, let me know what you think. Do you think this deal will be extended or not? Let me know in the comments. Again, all comments are welcome. You don't have to agree with me. to leave a comment. Far from it. I would prefer people that don't agree with me to leave comments. Hopefully I'm wrong, as I was wrong before in thinking that Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine. Hopefully this time I'm right and they do extend the deal and keep this happening. Keep the grain, the exports flowing from Ukraine. But we need to be mindful of the times in which we live. All of this points to good news, guys, that Jesus is coming back. So let me know your thoughts. Leave your comments below. Make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. When you do that, these videos go out to more and more people, and they can hear the good news of Jesus Christ. So make sure to do that, and God willing, I will see you on Monday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.